Good evening everyone, I'm the storyteller and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we start, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave a comment when you're ready. Make yourself comfortable and relax. Night had fallen like any other night. My son Miguel and I decided to go for a walk in the park, which at that time of day was a bit clearer and was only a few blocks from home. It was a place we knew well, with winding paths and a small lake in the center. Miguel had always loved to run and explore every corner. His laughter, full of life, resonated in my mind. As I contemplated his inexhaustible energy as we walked, the sky slowly darkened, but I paid no attention. The clouds were gathering, and a cool breeze began to blow. Miguel, excited, ran towards the playground. I saw him climbing the play structure, sliding down the slides, and laughing out loud. That moment of happiness vanished when the first thunder rumbled in the It's an ominous sound that made my stomach contract. The rain began to fall and soon became a torrent that soaked the ground and surrounded us with a deafening sound. I looked around looking for shelter, but the park was almost deserted. Most of the visitors had left, leaving me practically alone with my son, Miguel. I shouted, trying to make myself heard above the roar of the rain. "Come back here." But I received no reply. As the rain intensified, I decided it was time to leave. I walked quickly towards him, but I didn't see him. All I could see was a shadow that passed quickly through my vision. It was a man standing under a tree, watching. My heart braced. I couldn't make out his features, but his posture was unsettling. Something about his presence made me feel he wasn't just a passerby. I ignored the cold running down my back and called Miguel one more time. The sound of my footsteps was drowned out by the noise of the rain. When I reached the playground, Miguel was simply not there. My heart sank and panic began to take hold of me. I looked around, searching for his small figure among the equipment, but there was no sign of him. I screamed in desperation. The rain was pouring down, soaking my clothes and turning the ground into a quagmire. I started running, calling his name, but the echo was lost in the noise of the storm. I looked towards where the man had been, but there was no sign of him. My steps quickened, anxiety taking hold of me. I ran towards the lake, thinking that perhaps he had gone to look at the ducks, but when I arrived, the place was empty and the water was churned up by the incessant rain. I stopped for a moment, trying to my breathing. Despair was beginning to take shape in my chest. I went back to search the play area, checking behind the swings and the climbing frames. It was as if Miguel had vanished. The idea that something could have happened to him paralyzed me. The image of the man continued to haunt my mind, and the feeling that he wasn't alone in the park intensified. I decided I had to get out of there. I started walking towards the exit of the park, my eyes scanning every corner. Miguel, I kept calling, but my voice sounded increasingly distant, as if the storm was swallowing everything. When I reached the entrance, I saw a group of people taking shelter under a kiosk. I approached quickly, my heart pounding. I asked them if they had seen a small child, but they all shook their heads. By that time, I was overwhelmed by anxiety. I returned to the park, my mind filled with dark thoughts. The idea that someone could have taken Miguel filled me with terror. Every step I took was torture. I feared the time would slip away from me. The rain was still falling, but now it seemed like a backdrop for my worst fears. As I searched, I noticed that the park, which had once been a familiar place, now felt strange, almost hostile. The shadows of the trees seemed to lengthen, and the sound of water hitting the ground resonated like a heartbeat. Despair became a constant pressure in my chest. I decided to divide the park into sections, systematically searching every corner: the duck area, the flower path, the bench facing the lake. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see my son with his carefree smile, but each time what I found was silence and rain. My mind began to wander. I thought of the man I had seen earlier. Was it him? Could he have been behind my son's disappearance? My heart quickened at the possibility. I needed to find him. Not only Miguel but also answers. Finally, I came to a small clearing in the park where there was an old oak tree. The rain had begun to ease, but the atmosphere was still charged with tension. I looked towards the tree and saw something on the ground. I approached and my heart stopped. It was a small shoe, Miguel's shoe. A shiver ran through my body. The rain stopped mattering to me. I could only think about what that meant. I looked around looking for some clue, something that would tell me where he had gone. My mind returned to the man. I knew I had to find him. I ran back to the path where I had last seen him. I looked in every direction, my anxiety growing inside me. The rain had eased off a little, but the air was still charged with tension. Darkness was beginning to close in on me, making every shadow seem more threatening. Suddenly I heard a noise behind me, a branch cracking. I turned quickly, but there were only trees. The feeling that someone was watching me did not go away. I began to walk faster, my feet splashing in the mud. The idea that Miguel was in danger pushed me to keep going, to not give up. The park felt increasingly desolate. The rain had made the air thick and each step seemed heavier. I started shouting his name again, hoping he could hear me, but the reality was that I was alone, trapped in my own nightmare. I came to a path that led to the forest bordering the park. It wasn't a place I had planned to go, but the idea that my little boy could be there drove me forward. The darkness thickened as I entered the trees, the sound of the rain muffling around me. Each step I took was a struggle between hope and fear. The possibility that Miguel was in danger filled me with determination, but the forest was dark and silent, which increased my anxiety. As I advanced, the feeling that something was wrong intensified. After a while, I came to a clearing. The rain didn't stop. I looked around looking for any sign, but there was nothing, only silence and shadows. I decided to get out of there. I started to go back along the path, but fear made me lose all sense of direction. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound was amplified in my mind. I was completely lost, and desperation made me run in circles. I found a path that seemed to lead back to the park. Desperation made me quicken my pace. With each step my heart beat faster, and the rain continued like a curtain hiding the world. Upon arriving back at the park, the atmosphere had changed. The light from the nearest street lamp flickered, and the sound of the rain had turned to a whisper. I looked around, and the solitude of the place weighed on me like a slab of stone. I started to search the places I had already checked, but there was no trace. Desperation turned into a feeling of emptiness. The idea that he might have disappeared completely filled me with indescribable terror. I felt the cold of the night closing in on me, and the park felt darker than before. By this time my mind was in chaos. What had happened? Where was Miguel? Fear and guilt overwhelmed me. It had been my responsibility to look after him, and now he was lost in this place. The rain began to fall harder again, and the sound became deafening. I ran aimlessly, my footsteps echoing in the night. Every noise was amplified in my mind, but it didn't matter anymore. All I could think about was my son, finding him before it was too late. I decided to go to the nearest police station. The idea that the police might be able to help gave me a small ray of hope. I ran towards the city center, feeling the rain following me. I was filled with anguish, but my determination to find my son was stronger. When I arrived at the police station, the neon lights illuminated the dark night. I burst in, desperately seeking help. The police officers looked at me, and I quickly explained the situation. They moved, taking my details, but the wait felt endless. They offered me help and sent a group to search the park. As I waited, anxiety consumed me. Every second felt like an eternity. The rain kept falling, and the memory of Miguel tormented me. The hours passed, but there was no news. Frustration and fear took hold of me. Where was my son? The idea that someone could have hurt him was unbearable. The night became a labyrinth of anguish, and the rain seemed endless. After a while, an officer returned. His face was grave. He told me that they had searched all over the park and the surrounding area, but had found nothing. Despair washed over me. The rain was still falling, but it didn't matter anymore. The idea that Miguel was lost, perhaps in the hands of someone who had no mercy, filled me with indescribable terror. I left the police station, the rain pelting my face. I looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of the world fall on my shoulders. I walked slowly, lost in my thoughts, not knowing what to do next. Search had begun, but the storm that had started that night was still raging in my heart. In the distance, the sound of laughter echoed. It was something familiar, a memory of my son that seemed to mock my pain. I looked into the darkness, wondering if I would ever hear that laughter again. In that moment, I knew the search was not over. My determination was ignited. I will not rest until I find my son. The struggle was just beginning, and the story of that rainy night would become a tale of despair and hope. 10 years have passed since that fateful night in the park, but the rain has never stopped falling in my memory. Every drop that hits the ground reminds me of Miguel, his laughter, his boundless energy. Although time seems to have erased many things, my hope remains alive like a small flame that refuses to be extinguished. I have searched every corner, investigated every lead, and spoken to countless people, but the truth is that time has made the search more difficult. However, on each anniversary of his disappearance, I find myself back in that park, sometimes in the rain, sometimes in the bright sunshine, but always with the same purpose: to keep looking. Life has taken its course, and I have learned to live with pain and uncertainty, but in my heart I know that Miguel is still part of me. In every ray of sunshine that breaks through the clouds, and every whisper of the wind, I feel his presence, as if he were telling me not to give up. Despite the years, I still keep his room intact, like a shrine of memories. Every time I see his bicycle leaning against the wall or his jacket hanging on the rack, a wave of hope washes over me. Maybe one day my son will return. Maybe one day the rain will bring an answer. My hope has not faded. The search continues, and each passing day is a new reminder that a father's love never dies. I'm convinced that somehow I will meet him again. That cold, rainy night 15 years ago marked a before and after in my life. I will never forget the details. Each scene has become an open wound in my memory, always fresh, always aching. I was young at the time and had only started working at the police station a few months earlier. Although I had already seen complicated situations, nothing had prepared me for what I was about to encounter. I received the call around midnight during a quiet shift, when the rain had started to fall relentlessly. The voice on the radio was tense and urgent: an emergency at a house near my location. I remember the road, the street lights casting shadows on the wet road, the patter of rain on the windscreen, and the feeling that something dark was about to fall apart. When I arrived at the address, I saw a modest house with a simple facade, barely distinguishable in the half. The interior lights were on, and through the windows I could make out shadows moving frantically. As I approached the door, I prepared myself mentally for what I might find, unaware that it would haunt me for years to come. I entered the house, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of damp mixed with the pungent aroma of cheap disinfectant. It was an old house with walls stained by time and modest, worn-out decoration that spoke of years of neglect. The scene that awaited me was overwhelming. In the living room was an old woman with a distorted face, trembling from head to toe without saying a word. She seemed to have aged decades and minutes, and the terror in her expression was enough to put me on high alert. I knew that the worst was in the next room. As I approached, I saw the trail of blood dripping from the door to the carpet. A thick silence filled the air, barely broken by the muffled gasps of the old woman in the room. As I opened the door, I was confronted by an image that would haunt me in recurring nightmares ever since. On the floor of the room, under the light of an old lamp, lay a young man. He was barely 14 years old, his pale skin contrasting with the dark pool of blood that spread out around him. The bullet wound in his chest was small, but it had been enough to stop his heart. Next to him, in a state of shock and with the gun still in her trembling hands, was his younger sister, a girl of only 8 years old. The image was impossible to process. She could barely hold the gun, an old, heavy, rusty revolver that for some inexplicable reason had ended up in her. And the girl was neither crying nor screaming. She was simply standing there, motionless, with an empty expression, lost in an abyss of incomprehension. I froze at the scene, not knowing whether to approach or keep my distance, and a chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran down my spine. The old woman in the room began to sob, and I immediately understood what had happened. She was the wife of the children's uncle, who looked after them while their mother worked night shifts to support them. Apparently the gun belonged to her husband, a man who, as I later discovered, kept it in a dark corner of the closet with the idea of protecting his family from any threat. But that night, fate had been merciless. I stood watching the scene, breathing heavily, unable to react immediately. The horror of the situation was too much to take in. I approached slowly and took the gun away from the girl's hands, careful not to frighten her anymore. She offered no resistance, barely seeming to register my presence. Her eyes were fixed on nothing, and it was clear that she did not fully understand what had happened. She was a child, innocent in her ignorance, and the victim of a tragedy that should never have touched her. Questions began to accumulate in my mind. How had the gun got into her hands? Had she been playing? Had someone left it there by accident? My mind was trying to make sense of something that deep down had no explanation. The revolver should have been out of the reach of any child. It should have been impossible for a tragedy of this magnitude to occur, but there it was, undeniable, like a scar engraved on reality. The other officers arrived shortly afterwards and took charge of the scene, but the echo of the old woman's muffled screams, the silence of the girl, and the empty gaze of the body on the ground remained etched in my memory. That night was long. The preliminary investigation revealed that the uncle had been careless with the gun, leaving it on a low, unsecured shelf, thinking that the children would never find it. But childish curiosity, or perhaps simple chance, had led the girl to discover the revolver, and in an innocent act, she would point it at her brother, unaware of the deadly consequences of a single shot. Days passed, and the memory of that scene took hold of my mind like a permanent shadow. I tried to get on with my life, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the girl standing there, holding the gun with an expressionless face and vacant eyes. My job required me to be strong to deal with the worst of humanity, but that image went beyond any limit. It was too much for me, a horror that stalked me even in my moments of calm. Time passed, but the weight of that night did not disappear. I tried to take refuge in routine, in duty, but there was always something that made me remember. Perhaps it was the rain, the sound of water hitting the roof of my car, the silence of an empty house at the end of a shift. There was always something that dragged me back to that moment, to that dark room, and to the impotence I felt when I saw the tragedy that a single bullet had unleashed years later. Even after seeing other difficult scenes, I felt that nothing compared to that night. The wound it had left me with did not heal, but sank deeper and deeper into my being. I understood with time that there was something in that experience that I could not overcome, a helplessness rooted in the depths of my spirit. That night, I understood that life is fragile, that a single mistake, a momentary lapse of concentration can shatter lives and rob the innocence of those who least deserve it. I stopped thinking in terms of heroes and villains, of seeing the world in terms of good and bad. Instead, I saw people as complex shadows full of weaknesses and fatal moments. Today, after so many years, I find myself trapped in the echo of that night. Every raindrop takes me back to that house, to that boy on the floor, and to that girl with the gun in her hands. The scar is still open, the weight is still on my shoulders, and the horror of what I experienced that night has not lost its intensity. I don't know if it not ever will. Perhaps there are tragedies that remain there motionless in time, like a portrait that haunts us endlessly. It all started so fast on any given night when my friend and I were carefree, like someone who has never known true fear. We were walking back from a party, barely exchanging jokes and small talk, when a vehicle pulled up next to us. I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. I felt the tug on my arm, the pressure on my mouth, and suddenly we were in the dark. I couldn't see well in that closed vehicle, but I could feel my friend next to me breathing heavily, both of us silent, trapped in a spiral of panic that neither of us knew how to manage. Face, I knew he was scared too, although he was trying to keep calm. We could hear the cold voices of the kidnappers, their curt instructions, and the silence that fell over us. After each sentence as heavy as a tombstone, they warned us to follow every order to the letter, not to do anything stupid. Every time they said it, I felt a stab of fear run through my body. I had to survive. I would do whatever it took. But my friend, he was different. He couldn't bear the idea of being subdued. As soon as we entered that abandoned cabin, a damp and dark place in the middle of nowhere, I knew it. I could see in his eyes that he wasn't going to accept being there, that he was willing to risk anything rather than give in. Perhaps he thought it was a question of bravery, that he had to face our captors, challenge their authority in some way. I, on the other hand, just wanted to live, but I knew that if he did something impulsive, we would both suffer the consequences. The rain pounded furiously on the roof of the hut, like a constant heartbeat, like a clock marking the passing of time. The atmosphere was charged with fear and tension. I scanned every corner, trying to work out when they would take us to the point of no return. But at that moment, what terrified me most was the impatience I saw in my friend's eyes. I knew that something inside him had broken. He didn't want to listen. He didn't want to wait. It was the first time he had let his guard down, that he tried to escape. They had barely left us unguarded, and he gave me a sign. He nodded towards the door, whispering that it was our chance, that we couldn't just sit there waiting. But I knew it would be a mistake to try. We were in no position to confront our captors. I tried to warn him with my eyes, silently begging him not to do it, to stay put, but he was determined. With a quick, bold movement, he got up and ran for the door. The sound of his footsteps was almost inaudible under the din of the storm, but time seemed to freeze when one of the kidnappers caught up with him. There was a moment of struggle, a moment in which I thought that maybe, just maybe, he could make it, but the violence with which they knocked him down took my breath away. I saw his body collapse to the ground, the blows that fell upon him and the scream he tried to stifle as the rain continued to fall, oblivious to our tragedy. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. Terror had devoured me from within. I could feel the blood leaving my face, my legs trembling as I watched the inevitable outcome take hold of him. The kidnappers were furious, and their faces, distorted by rage and threat, made it clear to us that there would be no mercy for us. I saw how they approached him, the violence in their eyes, and the bonus in their eyes, and the brutality in their movements. When the final blow fell on my friend, something in me broke too. I knew there was no way to reverse it, that any hope of surviving together had disappeared. Life escaped from his body under that merciless storm, and I knew that from that moment on, I was alone. There was no more room for bravery, or all that remained was the urgency to escape, to find a way out of that place before they decided it was my turn too. The storm raged on, as if the universe itself were witnessing the tragedy, powerless and deaf to our suffering. I felt a primitive instinct, a desperate need to survive. As their voices faded into the storm, and they took my friend away, I saw my chance. I had barely a moment, but it was enough. I got up, driven by fear, and ran for the exit. Every step I took was a risk, every movement a chance to be seen. But the instinct to survive was stronger than my fear. The rain wrapped around me as soon as I got outside. I was soaked, my legs nearly giving out from exhaustion, but I didn't stop. I ran without looking back, feeling the sticky mud on my feet and hearing thunder crashing above me like a warning. The image of my friend, his final moment, echoed in my mind, impossible to forget. In the middle of the darkness and rain, I kept running. My lungs burned. My legs trembled, but something kept pushing me forward, anywhere away from that nightmare. Every step was agony. Every meter felt endless. But then, like a miracle, I saw the lights of a vehicle coming down the road. I waved my arms with what little strength I had left, hoping someone would stop, hoping they'd understand the fear I had just escaped. The car stopped. Without hesitation, I rushed toward it. The driver's face showed shock when they saw me drenched, shaken and wide-eyed. I didn't need to say much, just a few broken words were enough. Without asking questions, the driver took me straight to the nearest police station. The hours that followed were a blur of questions, explanations, and memories I wanted to erase. The people responsible had fled before help could arrive, but the authorities managed to confirm what had happened. Seeing my friend again, even under a sheet, was like reliving every second of that night, the storm, the panic. The last time I saw him, days and weeks passed, but that image stayed with me. The authorities explained that it seemed like a plan gone wrong. The captors had intended something else, but everything spiraled out of control. My friend's attempt to break free had set off a chain reaction that ended in chaos. Yes, I survived, but that night became a shadow I carry with me, a memory that never truly fades. Even now, every time I close my eyes, hear the rumble of a storm. Every time the wind blows like it did that night, I relive the terror, the horror of being a witness and a survivor of something that should never have happened. The journey to my parents' village had been long and tedious. The winding dark road stretched out in front of me on a night of incessant rain. The windshield was a thin shield between me and the outside world, which seemed to be shrouded in a dense, gloomy fog. I could barely see the road lights, and fatigue was beginning to weigh heavily on my eyelids. The dashboard clock read 2 in the morning, and I still had more than 2 hours to go before reaching home. I had no choice but to find a place to rest for a while before continuing on my way. In the middle of that desolate road, I came across a modest hotel whose twinkling lights seemed like a welcome sign. In the midst of the darkness, the place didn't promise much. A 2-story building with worn paint and signs indicating that it was a lodging house. At another time, perhaps I would have moved on without looking twice, but I was so exhausted that any place seemed suitable. As I parked, I noticed that the parking lot was almost empty, except for a couple of old cars that were barely distinguishable in the rain. The reception area was small and gloomy, with a counter that looked as old as the building itself. As I checked in, I noticed the face of the receptionist, a serious-looking man with an absent gaze and a stern expressio, and he handed me the key and showed me to my room on the 2nd floor, at the end of a dark corridor. Room was nothing special, a single bed, a small table, and a window through which one could barely see. The rain falling relentlessly, I collapsed onto the bed exhausted, and soon fell into a deep sleep, lulled by the incessant patter of the water. Crash woke me in the middle of the night, startled. I tried to figure out what had happened, but all I could hear was the sound of the rain pounding down. I remained motionless for a few minutes, listening in the darkness of the room, while my mind tried to find a rational explanation, but silence once again took Over the place, all that could be heard was the slow, heavy breathing of my own confusion. After a while, I decided to get up and see if there was any sign of activity in the hotel. When I opened the door to the room, the corridor was in darkness, barely lit by a flashing lamp that seemed to cast disturbing shadows. I went downstairs, each step echoing in the silence. Everything seemed deserted. A strange feeling began to grow inside me, a subtle fear that I couldn't ignore. When I arrived at the reception, the atmosphere was even gloomier than I remembered. The dim light barely illuminated the counter, but it was enough to show something that made me immediately step back behind the counter. The receptionist lay on the floor, his body motionless, his eyes open, and a frozen expression of surprise on his face. The pale color of his skin and the dark stain on his chest confirmed what I feared. He was dead. My heart began to beat fast and a chill ran down my spine. The metallic smell in the air was unmistakable. I looked around, searching for some sign of movement, some explanation for what had happened, but the place was silent, as if time had stopped. There was no sign of anyone else, no clues as to who could have done this, just the body of the receptionist and the echo of my own breathing resonating in the stillness. Despair began to take hold of me. I tried to use the reception phone to call the police, but the line was dead. My cell phone, in a cruel twist of irony, had no signal in the middle of that storm. I felt trapped, as if the hotel had been transformed into a death trap from which I could not escape. As the minutes passed, the initial adrenaline gave way to a more controlled panic. I remembered seeing a payphone on the other side of the parking lot when I arrived, so without thinking twice, I decided to go out and run there. The rain and the darkness didn't matter. I just needed to ask for help. I ran towards the entrance door, and when I opened it, the rain hit me hard, soaking me instantly. The lights in the parking lot barely shone, casting long, distorted shadows that made everything seem even more sinister. I reached the payphone and my hands trembled as I tried to dial the emergency number. This time, luckily, I managed to get through. On the other end of the line, a professional voice asked me to explain what had happened. I tried to relate the events as quickly as possible, ignoring the terror that was taking hold of me. The operator assured me that they would send a patrol car as soon as possible. I hung up the phone, and at that moment a strange feeling washed over me. I wasn't alone. As I turned around, I saw a shadow moving on the other side of the parking lot. Near the entrance to the hotel, the figure vanished into the darkness before I could make out who or what it was, but the simple fact of knowing that someone else was there made me feel more vulnerable than ever. The killer could still be in the hotel, hiding, watching me, and that filled me with an indescribable fear. I hurried back to my room, closed the door and bolted it. I stood motionless, listening, waiting for the sound of the patrol car. Every minute seemed like an eternity. Every shadow cast on the walls by the rain seemed threatening. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I heard the distant sound of approaching sirens. The police had arrived, and my relief was immediate. I cautiously made my way downstairs and saw two officers enter the hotel. I explained everything. I had seen, how I had found the receptionist, and my suspicion that someone was still in the building. The officers searched the premises while I waited in the lobby. One of them returned shortly afterwards, confirming the death of the receptionist, and mentioned that they had found signs of a struggle in the reception area. They informed me that apparently the murderer had tried to steal money from the cash register before being surprised, and in the struggle the receptionist lost his life. But the worst part was that they had no idea where the culprit was. The muddy footprints on the ground suggested that someone had escaped, getting lost in the darkness of the night that morning. I found myself wondering if the killer had been watching me the whole time from some corner of the hotel, waiting for the right moment to act. That feeling of vulnerability, of being at the mercy of someone so cruel and dangerous did not leave me, not even when the officers escorted me out of the hotel with the first ray of sunlight. I left that place leaving behind the memory of a terrifying night that even today lingers in my memory like an indelible shadow. The rain fell with merciless, unrelenting fury, as if someone had opened the floodgates with no intention of closing them again. I ran down the street with no clear destination, just looking for some shelter, some roof that would take me away from the storm raging above me. My shoes were completely soaked, and the freezing water seeped through my coat, embracing me with an uncomfortable dampness that penetrated to the bone. Then I saw it, a small, unassuming bar with a red neon sign that flickered in a slow off-beat rhythm. It was a place that in another situation I would have passed by. The light inside seemed dim, the windows dirty, and the old wooden door was chipped and broken at the bottom. However, in that storm, any shelter was good. I went in without thinking too much. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, laden with a smell of damp alcohol and stale tobacco. A forgotten place in some corner of the city where the walls seemed to absorb secrets and the smoke became embedded in the worn wallpaper. There were barely a couple of people at the tables at the back, their eyes averted, absorbed in their own worlds. All around me it was dark, barely broken by a lamp at the other end of the bar. I walked over to the bar and sat down on a cracked leather stool, grateful at least for the shelter from the storm. I ordered a double whiskey, hoping to feel the burn in my throat and lungs, anything to remind me that I was at least out of the cold. As I drank in silence, I tried to ignore the crash of water beating against the windows and the gusts of wind that shook the door every so often. But then, without realizing it, I noticed a presence at my side. A man had slipped onto the stool next to mine with the unsteady gait and sunken eyes of someone who had been deep in the bottle for a long time. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a sour mixture of old alcohol, sweat, and something more metallic like rust. My instincts told me to ignore him, not to make eye contact, but something about him forced me to look at him out of the corner of my eye. He was a middle-aged man with hard, sharp features, and his eyes, which seemed to be plunged in darkness at a disturbing brightness, a cold intensity that contrasted with his relaxed expression. He looked like a man of the street, one of those who went unnoticed in the light of day, but whose face could be a ghost in the night. I started to talk more to himself than to me, and each word, although bleached by drunkenness, had weight, a tinge of repressed violence. As he drank, he reeled off stories, fragments of confessions that seemed to want to be freed from his mind, as if the alcohol opened a door to something dark that had been locked away for a long time. He talked about people who, according to him, deserved what he had done to them. His stories were fragmentary and veiled, but there was no doubt in his tone, a kind of icy calm that made it clear that he was neither joking nor repentant. He said he had learned to spot that kind of person, those who had an air of weakness, of submission, as if they had the mark of predestined victims on their foreheads. He didn't give specific details, only hints, vague descriptions of his encounters. He spoke of punishments and settling, of scores of nocturnal encounters in lonely places where no one could hear a cry muffled by the rain. He would stop every so often, as bestiuther, if tasting his own memories, with a slight shudder that caused me a mixture of revulsion and fascination. As he spoke, my mind tried to rationalize what I was hearing, trying to convince me that he was just a drunk man telling made-up stories to try to impress. But fear crept in, a viscous sensation that invaded me and told me that something in his words was real. The way he stared into space, as if reliving every moment, told me that he wasn't improvising. The man continued talking, increasingly focused on the details, on the processes. He said he preferred to act on rainy days when the sound of the Water drowned out the noise when the streets were deserted and the passers-by disappeared. The rain, he said, was his ally, a faithful accomplice that erased footprints and diluted any trace. My body tense when I noticed that his gaze shifted towards me, as if he had sensed my discomfort. I tried to avoid his gaze, to pretend that I wasn't paying attention to him, but his presence was like a shadow clinging. And to my side, I didn't dare to move or to ask for the bill. Any gesture that broke the silence seemed like a provocation to me, something that could trigger a reaction from him. Then he began to talk about one of his recent experiences. He did so in a lower tone, as if it were a secret to be shared in whispers. He described how he had come across a man who fit his profile, someone walking alone on a rainy night like me, someone who seemed to simply be in the wrong place. He told how he had followed him, how he had approached unnoticed, enjoying every step that shortened the distance. He described the details with such precision that my mind involuntarily drew the scene, almost as if I were the prey in his story. He spoke to me as if he knew me, as if he understood my fears, my thoughts, and his words were sharp knives that tore through what little courage I had left. By the time he finished his story, I was paralyzed. The idea of getting up and running away seemed almost absurd. I was certain that if I did, he would follow me, just as he had done with the people in his stories. I knew that, like them, I would become part of one of his stories, a fragment of his dark memory. As he continued to speak, my mind began to look for ways out, any strategy that might help me escape without provoking him. I felt every second like a sharp edge on my skin, the certainty that I was caught in his net without having planned it, a piece in his macabre game. The rain was still falling heavily outside, and in that dark and lonely bar, the only certainty was that if I didn't move soon, I would end up becoming the next link in his chain of stories. As the man continued to speak with his drawl and his dark gaze, I felt a slight tremor in my coat pocket. It was my phone, a spark of hope. I slid my hand out slowly, trying not to draw his attention, and took out my cell phone. I pretended to check the time, but in reality, I was looking for my brother's number. With trembling fingers, I sent a short, desperate message indicating the address of that bar and asking him to come and get me urgently. The minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I felt that my own breathing could give me away, and the words of the stranger who continued to tell his macabre stories resonated like an ever closer threat. Every second seemed to bring danger closer. Every detail he gave seemed like a warning that became personal. Finally, the sound of the door opening made me jump involuntarily. I turned my head and saw my brother standing there, wet from the storm, but with an expression of firmness and determination. I got up without looking at the man, trying to remain calm. "There you are," I said loudly, addressing my brother as if our meeting were something casual. I felt the stranger's gaze fixed on my back, and a chill ran through me as we walked towards the exit. When we went outside, the relief was like the first breath after having been submerged in deep water. Without looking back, we got into the car, and my brother drove off in silence, respecting the fear in my eyes. From the window, I watched the bar disappear into the rain, leaving that disturbing shadow behind. That night, the rain continued to fall, but it would no longer reach me. The rain did not let up that day. The sky seemed covered by a stormy blanket that darkened the atmosphere until I felt completely alone. I went to the cemetery with a weight on my chest, stronger than usual, as if I knew something was about to happen. The water fell in thick drops, forming streams in dirt roads that led to the grave of my twin brother, my other half, my lost reflection. Almost a year had passed since we buried him, yet the pain remained fresh. I knew I wasn't ready to lose him, as if life had torn away a fundamental part of me, leaving a void that could only be filled in that cemetery. Why, even if only in appearance, the image of his gravestone with his name engraved in stone hurt me more than I dared to admit in silence. I stood in front of it, watching the raindrops slide down the carve. At letters, wishing it were all a mistake, a dream from which I would wake up when I got home. The wind whistled through the trees, and an inexplicable chill took hold of me, different from what I felt. At other times, somehow that day, sadness was mixed with a strange feeling almost of being watched in the distance. I could see a figure among the gravestones, someone who seemed to be standing still, as if they were also visiting someone. But there was something about his posture, the way he was looking at me sideways, that put me on. My God, the minutes passed, and I tried to concentrate on my thoughts, on the memory of my brother, and on the comfort of knowing that in some way I was still honoring him. But the man's presence was still there, like a clinging shadow on the edge of my vision. Every so often I would look at him, noticing how little by little he seemed to be approaching with a calculated slowness, one step then another, as if each movement were measured so as not to disturb me, although he had already succeeded in doing so. A knot of uneasiness settled in my stomach. It wasn't the first time I had seen someone in the cemetery, but something about this man was different. He approached me with cold determination. Without hesitation, with a fixed gaze that I was unable to avert, my heart began to beat fast as I tried to understand the reason for his presence, the reason for his attention towards me. It occurred to me that perhaps he was confusing me with someone else. But that assumption was shattered when I saw that even when he was just a few steps away from me, there was not the slightest hint of doubt in his gaze. He knew exactly who I was. Panic overcame me. I thought of backing away, of leaving without looking back, but something kept me there. There was something disturbing about his expression, a mixture of anxiety and determination that seemed to go beyond a simple misunderstanding. I didn't know whether to run or stay, and while my mind debated between these two options, he stopped right in front of me. He didn't speak, but his eyes said more than I was willing to accept. There was something in that look that stirred me inside, something familiar and at the same time deeply disturbing. Despite not remembering having seen that man in my life, his face seemed strangely familiar, as if somewhere in my memory his image existed, engraved in a forgotten corner of my childhood. I couldn't put my finger on it, but his presence was like a shadow from a past I had never understood. My hands were cold. The uneasiness of the situation was heightened by the silence that followed every glance we exchanged. My mind began to work in the background, recalling things, connecting loose threads, vague memories of my childhood, blurred faces, whispers that did not form complete words. And suddenly something clicked. It was like a bolt of lightning in the midst of darkness. I understood that the man in front of me was not a stranger, but a shadow of something deeper, of a story that was never told to me. As the man moved forward and dropped a few words, the pieces of that puzzle began to fit together in a way I could never have imagined. The rain continued to fall incessantly, but now the cold was different. My body was frozen, not only from the water, but also from the discovery of what had really happened. This man, the same one I had avoided out of fear, was my father. He had been absent all my life, an absence marked by the silence and lack of information of those who had raised me. He was the real reason for my incomplete existence, for that inexplicable emptiness. His confession was piecing together in my mind like a jigsaw puzzle. He told me about a fatal incident, an accident that had destroyed my real mother, and event of tragedy and horror that had marked her life and changed the course of mine without my knowing anything about it. That was why he had disappeared. He had spent years in prison, paying for something that had not been premeditated, but which even so had cost my mother her life. The parents who had brought me up, the ones I had called Mum and Dad throughout my childhood were in reality strangers who had intervened to give me a normal life to hide the truth from me. The shock of this revelation was indescribable. It was as if my very being had been broken into pieces, and every part of my life would now be revealed as a lie designed to protect me from. Past that now crushedly, I could feel the tears mixing with the rain, but I could not tell whether I was crying out of sadness, anger, or sheer terror at what I had just discovered. This man, my father, someone I had never heard of in my entire life, was in reality a figure as real and terrifying as the worst of the monster. I could imagine there was no malice in his eyes. There was a dry and deep pain, the pain of someone who had lost the person they loved and had been separated from their children by that same event. But that knowledge did not bring me comfort. It only left me with a feeling of unease that weighed on my chest and made me short of breath. In the end, when he left, I stood in front of my brother's grave, the only person I really trusted. I felt betrayed, as if my own story had been ripped from my hands. The rain continued to fall, and at that moment I understood that the truth, far from bringing me peace, had condemned me to live with the uncertainty of who I really was, of what part of my life was true, and which had been a simple illusion. University was for me the beginning of a new life, an opportunity to leave behind the days of monotony and the village, and above all to start building a future. I didn't have high expectations, but I had arrived with the excitement of starting from scratch, surrounded by strangers, and with the freedom of living in a different place. It didn't take me long to find a house, rundown, but close enough to the campus to be convenient. The house belonged to an older man, tired, looking with empty eyes for the price he was offering, and its proximity to the university. It seemed like a good deal at first. The tranquility of the house was perfect for my studies. I got used to the creaking of the old wood under my feet, to the walls that seemed to whisper with every gust of wind, and to the shade of the trees that covered most of the windows, causing the sun's rays to filter in. For just a few minutes a day as the months went by, the landlord allowed me to sublet the adjoining room, a forgotten room at the end of the corridor, barely furnished but suitable for someone else. The offer suited me. The rent would be cheaper, and perhaps the company would make the loneliness of the nights more bearable. That was when Gabriel arrived. He was a quiet guy, tall and thin, with dark eyes that seemed to look right through you. I wasn't uncomfortable with his presence, at least not at first. His silence could be interpreted as simple introversion. We hardly crossed paths in the house, and the few encounters were brief. After a while, however, small details began to worry me. I would hear footsteps in the early hours of the morning echoing down the corridor, and several times I caught him staring at me from the shadows of the living room, with that deep, expressionless gaze that seemed to look right through my thoughts. One October night, the rain began to fall in torrents, flooding the streets and soaking the atmosphere with an oppressive humidity. I was locked in my room trying to concentrate on an essay when I heard footsteps outside my room. The whole house was plunged into a thick silence, and those footsteps abruptly broke the calm. I knew Gabriel was there. His movements had a strange, irregular rhythm, as if he deliberately stopped in front of my door before continuing on to the bathroom or the kitchen. I convinced myself that they were just my imagination, but Gabriel's presence began to transform into something disturbing, a shadow hanging over my life in that house. As the days went by, I noticed inexplicable changes in the house. Doors that I had left closed were found half open. My things were in disarray, and on several occasions I found objects that I didn't recognize, things that didn't belong to either of us. I felt trapped in a web of small disturbances that seemed intentional, almost as if someone were playing a game with me. My sleep began to be affected. I would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling of being watched, and I would often hear whispers that seemed to come from Gabriel's room. The tension grew until it reached its climax. One stormy night when the rain seemed to never stop, I remember I was in my bed looking at the ceiling and trying to fall asleep when suddenly I heard a thud that echoed in the hallway. I sat up, immobilized by a feeling of alarm. I was sure something had fallen, but I couldn't figure out what. The rain was pounding loudly on the windows, and the thunder seemed to emphasize my growing anxiety. I got up, and without turning on the light, opened the door to my room to look out into the hallway. It was completely dark, except for the faint illumination of a street lamp projecting distorted shadows through the windows. It was then that I saw a figure at the end of the corridor near the entrance to the kitchen. Although it was dark, I could make out Gabriel, who was standing motionless, staring at me. A chill ran through me. There was no reason for him to be there, and certainly not in complete darkness. Without making a sound, I retreated and closed the door, trying to think of a rational explanation. But the minutes passed, and I could still hear movement outside, footsteps, their breathing barely perceptible behind the thin door. The situation became unbearable. I felt cornered, and with every second that passed, I imagined increasingly dark scenarios. Time seemed to stand still until I heard something that made my blood run cold, a metallic, soft sound like the click of a knife being opened. My mind began to wander, and fear paralyzed me. My only option was to leave, to escape from that room and from Gabriel's menacing presence. I decided to wait for the storm to calm down, but then I heard someone handle the doorknob. The tense fingers and subtle noises confirmed what I had feared. Gabriel was outside, trying to open the door. Despair overcame me, and in a burst of improvised courage, I blocked the door with a chair. It was at that moment that I heard him mutter something, a barely audible whisper that filtered through the door. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his tone, low and sinister, suggested something dark, as if he were plotting to hurt me. The minutes that followed were psychological torture. His every movement, his every attempt to open the door resonated like an imminent sentence. Suddenly, everything went silent. I couldn't hear anything, not even breathing. I thought he had left that. Maybe it had all been a cruel joke, a sick manifestation of his disturbing personality. But then the sound of his voice flooded the hallway again, this time with a firmer tone. That whisper turned into clear and icy words spoken right outside my door. My heart was beating so fast that I couldn't imagine Gabriel couldn't hear it from the other side. I couldn't stay there all night, but fear prevented me from even moving. Then I heard a loud noise, as if something had broken. I turned my head and saw that the window of my room was open and icy air was coming in the middle of that storm. I saw a shadow moving towards the street. Gabriel was walking away into the rain with the same disturbing calm with which he had tormented me. I watched him disappear into the darkness, not knowing what had prompted his sudden retreat, but feeling that the nightmare had come to an end. The following morning, still feeling uneasy, I decided to call the police and tell them what had happened. I had not slept at all. Gabriel's face and his presence in the hallway continued to haunt me like a dark shadow. When a patrol arrived, the officers listened to my story with an increasingly serious expression. They asked me to enter the house to inspect Gabriel's room, and what they found only increased my anxiety. Among his things, they found several false IDs and personal items belonging to other people, photos, clothes, and small objects that had no explanation. But the most disturbing thing was the comment one of the officers made to me as we left. "We've been looking for him. Gabriel has been linked to several cases of disappearances and murders in other cities. He is an extremely dangerous man." That revelation hit me like a bucket of ice water. In that moment, I understood the real danger I had been in for weeks, sharing a roof with a man capable of atrocities I could barely imagine. Every disturbing look, every step in the night, every moment of tension took on a new meaning. I felt a chill down my spine as I realized how close I had come to becoming one of his victims. As the officers walked away, a strange relief washed over me, but also a deep horror at The realization that on that stormy night I had come face to face with a real monster. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I had always felt confident meeting people through Tinder and felt comfortable and safe in the process after all. Everyone likes a bit of adventure meeting someone new, going out for a drink, or just chatting. However, nothing I had experienced before prepared me for what happened that night. Mariana appeared in my life like any other girl, a light conversation, some exchanges of photos and messages, and an invitation to go out. It didn't seem anything out of the ordinary. There was something in her profile that caught my attention, the way she expressed herself, the way she wrote. She seemed interesting. Different at first. The conversations were calm, casual, nothing too intense. I didn't usually get too excited, but there was something about her that made my thoughts get stuck between each message. Finally, we agreed to meet. The night of the meeting came faster than I expected. Mariana told me she would be home alone, that her sister would be out partying, and we would have the house to ourselves. It seemed perfect to me. We talked about doing it in her neighborhood, a place that seemed quiet, although a bit out of the way. It'll be fun, she said in one of the last messages before we stopped talking to meet up. When I arrived at the neighborhood, something made me feel uncomfortable, but I couldn't immediately identify it. At first, it was just the rain. The storm had arrived earlier than expected, covering the sky with a dark blanket that presaged something more. The place was lonely, very quiet houses that looked abandoned, empty streets. There wasn't a single person in sight, and the street lights flickered on and off as if struggling to stay lit despite the drizzle. A cold sweat began to run down my forehead. I followed Mariana's instructions, which directed me by text message to a specific house, a house that seemed different from the others. The house was a bit old, one of those that had seen better days. The overgrown garden stretched towards a front door that was ajar, which seemed strange to me, but I tried to ignore it. I was already there, and everything seemed to be under control in the distance. The house even looked cozy, as if the storm and the abandonment could simply be irrelevant details. As I parked the car in front of the entrance, a feeling of unease washed over me. The first raindrops began to hit the windscreen hard. I looked towards the house, and for a moment I thought about turning around, but something held me back. I didn't know if it was my ego, my desire to meet Mariana, or simply the fact that I had come this far that I couldn't turn back. I decided to get out of the car. It was then that I knew, when the pressure in my chest grew unbearably. 3 men came out of nowhere like shadows emerging from the fog. I hadn't seen them coming. They were there a few steps away from me, surrounding the entrance to the house, looking at me with an intensity that left me in no doubt. My mind began to race, searching for reasons, excuses, anything that might make me think that all this was just a bad coincidence, a misunderstanding. The first blow came quickly and unexpectedly. I didn't see it. Having a metal pipe hit me hard on the back, and the pain shot through my body like an electric current. I staggered forward, but before I could react, the other 2 men pushed me to the ground, kicking me again and again with fury. I tried to get up to shout, but the pain and the metallic taste blood in my mouth made it difficult for me to move. The blows were relentless, a beating that seemed to have no end. Through the pain and confusion, I tried to think. I tried to scream for help, but the rain and the wind drowned everything out. I knew there was no one around, that I couldn't count on anyone to save me. My breathing became labored, and my vision began to blur. The rain continued to fall, washing the scene with its persistent noise. But it did not calm me. I could not understand how I had got here. All I knew was that there was no turning back. Somehow, I managed to turn onto my back, looking for something to defend myself with, anything, but there was nothing. My mind, as darkness took hold of me, began to wander. I remembered the house, the address, the conversations. What had happened? Why hadn't I seen the signs? Why hadn't I listened to the warning that my instinct had been shouting at me from the start? The feeling of vulnerability was deeper than any physical pain. I had risked too much trusting something as fragile as the promise of a stranger, but the damage was already done after taking my wallet and a few bills I had in my pockets. The men walked away. My mind was too clouded to understand what had happened. The blows, the violence, the fear, everything was mixed up in a kind of thick fog that enveloped me, preventing me from thinking clearly. I could feel the rain soaking my clothes, the ground cold and slippery, but my body seemed to be in automatic mode, as if one part of me was trying to cling to life, while the other had already given in to pain and despair. My vision was blurred, and each breath was like a struggle, but for some reason my mind managed to stay focused on one thing: my car, which I had left, parked there just a few steps from the house. With a titanic effort, I began towards the vehicle. The pain with every movement was unbearable, but I didn't stop. I knew that if I stayed there, if I didn't do something, I wouldn't survive. I was in a desolate neighborhood with no one around, with no hope of anyone helping me at that moment. The rain did not stop falling, and the sound of the water hitting the asphalt made me feel even more isolated, more alone in that place. That in a way had been my mistake. When I finally got to the car, I had trouble opening the door. My hands were clumsy, full of pain. Seeing my phone on the seat, a ray of hope crossed my mind. I picked it up with trembling hands. It didn't matter if it was wet. I switched it on and with difficulty dialed the emergency number. The sound of the call was all that could be heard in my ears, accompanying the constant patter of rain on the roof of the car. "What is your emergency?" The voice on the other end of the phone sounded distant, almost as if I were in another world. I couldn't speak properly, but I did my best to explain what had happened. I said something about 3 men and assault, that they had hit me, that I couldn't breathe, that I needed help. I felt my throat closing up, but I repeated my location anyway. It took the police a few minutes to respond. But in that time, my head seemed to be about to explode with so much pain. Time passed slowly, much slower than I would have liked. Every second that passed was another blow against my will, a feeling of helplessness that embraced me and would not leave me. The men had taken what they wanted, but they had left me with more than just physical pain. My mind, initially confused, began to make connections that I did not fully understand. Something was not right. Why had I been so blind? Why had I not listened to the warnings that my instinct had been giving me all along? Mariana, where was she? What was really going on? The police arrived later, although not as quickly as I would have liked. When I finally saw the dot lights of the patrol cars approaching, I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. Someone was finally there to help me, but I also knew that there was something else behind all this, something I couldn't fully understand. When the officers approached, they helped me out of the car and sat me down on the sidewalk, surrounded by the flashing lights of the patrol cars and the constant rain. The pain was still unbearable, but the presence of the police gave me a minimal sense of security as they attended to me. I tried to explain what had happened, to tell them about the men, about Mariana, and the strange neighborhood. My head was still only half functioning, but I told them what I could remember. One of the officers looked at me with a serious expression, almost as if something didn't fit in with my story. They asked me a few more questions, but the truth is that I couldn't remember many details. My mind was collapsing under the weight of pain and anguish. It was then that one of the officers mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He said that the place had been linked to several minor crimes over the last few months, and they had received reports about a gang of criminals operating in the area. My stomach twisted in a turn of horror. Mariana. It all suddenly made sense. The house, the neighborhood, the situation. It was all part of a bigger plan, something much more sinister than I had imagined. Mariana had been a part of it all. The Officers looked at me, probably noticing my panicked expression. They said to me, "It's likely you've walked into a trap, mate. This kind of thing is nothing new in that area, but luckily we've been able to dismantle some of their operations." I could feel the weight of the truth hitting me hard. Not only had I been the victim of a robbery, but I had also been on the verge of becoming something much worse. The men who attacked me were probably just a piece of something much bigger, something much more dangerous. And Mariana, now I understood that she had been nothing more than a decoy, a facade to lure me into their deadly game. They took me to the hospital in an ambulance, the flashing lights and sirens cutting through the dark night, while my body continued to protest with each jolt. I felt my broken ribs as a constant reminder of the danger I had faced, but despite the stabbing pain in my chest, I felt strange. Somehow lucky. Fortunately, I had not lost my life that night, although the feeling of having come close to death would haunt me for a long time. The doctors attended to me quickly. They took several X-rays and finally informed me that I had several broken ribs. They were not minor injuries, but luckily there was no serious internal damage. I was relieved by the diagnosis, but also marked by the experience. Nothing would be the same again. As I lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help thinking about how everything had happened so fast, how I had fallen into the trap, into the idea of meeting someone from an app without thinking about what might really be behind that screen. That same night when I was able to pick up my phone, I decided to uninstall Tinder. It was something I had been putting off since the police had told me about the neighborhood and the gangs involved, but in the end, uninstalling it was more than just a simple gesture. It was a commitment to myself never to put myself in that kind of situation again, not to allow my curiosity or the need to meet people to drag me back into that kind of risk. I decided that my safety and a well-being were worth more than any superficial encounter, more than the possibility of meeting someone new. I never went out with strangers again. That episode taught me a hard but necessary lesson. The adrenaline of fear became a kind of internal warning, something that kept me alert. I knew that in the world people are not always what they seem, and behind every profile, every message, there may be something dark waiting to catch you out. From that day on, I made a decision that would change my life forever. My safety came first, and I would not let the search for connections blind me to real danger. The rain was a wall separating me from everything that night. Each falling drop struck like a reminder, a litany bringing me back to the darkest days of my life, because from that moment on, the rain was no longer just water, but became a constant memory of loss, of a pain that knows no logic or time. Each storm dragged me back to that same corner of darkness, to that abyss where silence was a sharp blade and the echo of thunder, the screams of injustice that pursued me. I had met Clara on a random night, one of those nights when you don't think much about the future or the consequences. She was a woman with an enveloping smile and a gaze that seemed to speak of places and adventures that no one else could access. We had nothing in common, but sometimes that's all you need to let yourself go. What we had wasn't love. It was just something fleeting, an encounter that left an indelible mark. I saw her as someone to hang out with, someone to whom I could entrust a part of my loneliness and receive in return a night of relief. However, that night became something more, something much deeper, and without knowing it, something devastating. A few months later, Clara called me with a voice between breathless and nervous. She told me she was pregnant. The impact hit me like lightning. We weren't a couple, we didn't share a future, but there was this life forming, something I could no longer ignore. My mind was filled with confusion, but one certainty broke through. I wasn't. Expression, almost as if something didn't fit in with my story. They asked me a few more questions, but the truth is that I couldn't remember many details. My mind was collapsing under the weight of pain and anguish. It was then that one of the officers mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He said that the place had been linked to several minor crimes over the last few months, and they had received reports about a gang of criminals operating in the area. My stomach twisted in a turn of horror. Mariana. It all suddenly made sense. The house, the neighborhood, the situation, it was all part of a bigger plan, something much more sinister than I had imagined. Mariana had been a part of it all. The officers looked at me, probably noticing my panicked expression. They said to me, "It's likely you've walked into a trap, mate. This kind of thing is nothing new in that area, but luckily we've been able to dismantle some of their operations." I could feel the weight of the truth hitting me hard. Not only had I been the victim of a robbery, but I had also been on the verge of becoming something much worse. The men who attacked me were probably just a piece of something much bigger, something much more dangerous. And Mariana, now I understood that she had been nothing more than a decoy, a facade to lure me into their deadly game. They took me to the hospital in an ambulance, the flashing lights and sirens cutting through the dark night, while my body continued to protest with each jolt. I felt my broken ribs as a constant reminder of the danger I had faced, but despite the stabbing pain in my chest, I felt strange. Somehow lucky. Fortunately, I had not lost my life that night, although the feeling of having come close to death would haunt me for a long time. The doctors attended to me quickly. They took several X-rays and finally informed me that I had several broken ribs. They were not minor injuries, but luckily there was no serious internal damage. I was relieved by the diagnosis, but also marked by the experience. Nothing would be the same again. As I lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help thinking about how everything had happened so fast, how I had fallen into the trap, into the idea of meeting someone from an app without thinking about what might really be behind that screen. That same night when I was able to pick up my phone, I decided to uninstall Tinder. It was something I had been putting off since the police had told me about the neighborhood and the gangs involved, but in the end, uninstalling it was more than just a simple gesture. It was a commitment to myself never to put myself in that kind of situation again, not to allow my curiosity or the need to meet people to drag me back into that kind of risk. I decided that my safety and a well-being were worth more than any superficial encounter, more than the possibility of meeting someone new. I never went out with strangers again. That episode taught me a hard but necessary lesson. The adrenaline of fear became a kind of internal warning, something that kept me alert. I knew that in the world people are not always what they seem, and behind every profile, every message, there may be something dark waiting to catch you out. From that day on, I made a decision that would change my life forever. My safety came first, and I would not let the search for connections blind me to real danger. The rain was a wall separating me from everything that night. Each falling drop struck like a reminder, a litany bringing me back to the darkest days of my life, because from that moment on, the rain was no longer just water, but became a constant memory of loss, of a pain that knows no logic or time. Each storm dragged me back to that same corner of darkness, to that abyss where silence was a sharp blade, and the echo of thunder, the screams of injustice that pursued me. I had met Clara on a random night, one of those nights when you don't think much about the future or the consequences. She was a woman with an enveloping smile and a gaze that seemed to speak of places and adventures that no one else could access. We had nothing in common, but sometimes that's all you need to let yourself go. What we had wasn't love. It was just something fleeting, an encounter that left an indelible mark. I saw her as someone to hang out with, someone to whom I could entrust a part of my loneliness and receive in return a night of relief. However, that night became something more, something much deeper, and without knowing it, something devastating. A few months later, Clara called me with a voice between breathless and nervous. She told me she was pregnant. The impact hit me like lightning. We weren't a couple, we didn't share a future, but there was this life forming something I could no longer ignore. My mind was filled with confusion, but one certainty broke through. I wasn't. I was tormented by the knowledge that in his last moments, he must have felt fear, that he cried, that he needed me, and I was not there to protect him. I tried to find answers. I tried to understand how someone could have so little compassion, how someone could do something so inhuman. I looked for explanations in the police reports, in Clara's statement, in every piece of information that could give me a reason, but there were no reasons, only a dreadful and cruel coincidence, a fateful encounter between chance and the recklessness of a mother who had abandoned her child on the worst of nights. Every storm since then takes me back to that moment. The rain turns into tears, the rumbling of thunder into the despair I feel inside. On rainy nights I feel the storm pursuing me, the memories enveloping me again like a thick fog, reminding me of what I can no longer change, what I will never be able to recover. The sound of the rain on the roof becomes an echo that reminds me every second of the hole left in my life. The memory of his face became a shadow that I cannot leave behind. No matter how hard I try to move on, no matter how much I try to occupy my mind with other things, that image is always there waiting for me in the shadows, like a weight that refuses to leave me alone. On stormy nights when lightning briefly illuminates the darkness, I have the feeling that I can see him, feel his presence, hear his crying muffled by the storm. Perhaps one day this wound will become bearable. Perhaps with time the image of his face will stop haunting me from appearing in every corner of my mind, but in the meantime every storm reminds me of the horror of a night I cannot erase, the pain of having lost what I loved most. Because the rain since that night has ceased to be just water and has become an eternal lament that haunts me, that ties me to that last night when life, in an act of senseless brutality, took my son away from me. That night shift started like any other. The rain pounded down on the windscreen as I drove through deserted streets shrouded in a thick fog that made the atmosphere even more gloomy. The lights of the patrol car were reflected in the puddles, creating disturbing flashes in the darkness. It was a heavy night, the kind of night when time seems to stand still, and a strange feeling takes hold of you. Something deep down told me that it would be a night to remember, although I didn't really know why. The clock read 3 o'clock in the morning when the radio broke the silence with an emergency call. The tone of the voice I heard had a contained urgency, and that was enough to make my shoulders tense. It was about an old house in an almost abandoned part of the city. Someone had heard a strange scream in the neighbors, although few had called out of concern. I wasn't expecting to find anything too strange. Maybe someone who had had too much to drink or a domestic dispute, but the operator's voice made it clear that the call was unusual. I followed the road to that address, noticing how the city lights faded as I entered the oldest and most neglected part of the neighborhood. The streets were empty with a feeling of abandonment that intensified under the storm. Finally, I arrived at the house, a gloomy-looking building with peeling walls and windows that seemed to have seen better days. I got out of the patrol car and walked towards the door, feeling the weight of the rain soaking my jacket and the cold seeping into my bones. There was something unusual in the air, a kind of pressure that made each step feel heavier than the last. When I reached the doorstep, I noticed that the door was ajar, and a faint light filtered in from inside, casting long shadows on the wet floor. I opened the door fully, and upon entering, I was enveloped in a thick smell, a mixture of mold and damp, with a slight metallic note that I found disturbing. The house was completely silent, except for the occasional creak of the wood under my feet. I looked around and saw that the decor was old, fashioned, as if time had stopped decades ago. There was dusty furniture, paintings of unknown people hanging on the walls, and an old clock that curiously was showing the wrong time stopped at 10:11. I continued on, guided by the faint light coming from a room at the end of the corridor. Each step echoed in the silence as if the whole house were paying attention to my presence. I reached the entrance to the room, and when I glanced inside, I saw something that left me transfixed. In the center of the room, barely illuminated by a table lamp, was an elderly man sitting in a chair with his head tilted forward. The scene might have seemed harmless, even ordinary, were it not for the fact that there was something deeply disturbing about his posture. His head was tilted to one side, and his hands were crossed in his lap holding an old black and white photograph of a young woman. The man did not move. The skin of his face was an unnatural pallor, and his eyes, although open, showed no sign of life. It was then that I noticed a reddish line on his neck, as if it had been marked by a rope. The sight of that mark made me shudder, and a chill ran down my spine. I moved a little closer, and as I did so, something crunched under my feet. Looking down, I saw a dark pool stretching from the base of the chair. The blood, thick and clotted, had formed a trail that seemed to have seeped out from the wound in his neck. I took a deep breath, trying to control the impulse to run away, and tried to take in the situation. The man had been there for some time, maybe hours, maybe even days. Although the fresh puddle indicated that something in that house was still alive in a disturbing way, I scanned the room with my gaze, and then I noticed it. On the wall just behind the chair there was something written in irregular and clumsy handwriting, as if it had been traced in the dark. It was a word, or rather a name, written in large letters that seemed to have been painted with the same dark liquid that had formed the puddle on the floor. I approached, and although the paint was already dry, the name was clearly visible. Amelia. I didn't know anyone called Amelia. And yet, the name seemed to resonate in the atmosphere as if the walls themselves were whispering it. The whole house seemed to breathe in an eerie murmur, and the echo of that word reverberated in my mind unbearably. Trying to shake off that feeling, I backed out into the hallway, convinced that I should inspect the house more thoroughly. If there was someone else there, I had to find them. I walked in silence, trying not to make any noise, but the creaking of the wood under my feet seemed to amplify every step. I reached the staircase leading to the second floor, and looking up, I saw that the corridor was completely dark, as if the light avoided that corner of the house. I took a deep breath and began to climb, feeling how each step seemed to absorb me deeper into the heart of the house. The darkness thickened with each step, and the sound of my breathing was the only indication that I was still there, that I had not been swallowed up by the void. As I reached the top step, a half-open door caught my attention. I pushed the door open and entered a room full of papers scattered everywhere, torn photographs and handwritten notes, as if someone had been searching for something in desperation. On a table, a wooden box stood out from the mess. It was old, carved with strange symbols that seemed to have some hidden meaning. Opening it, I found several letters, all addressed to Amelia. They were love notes, heartbreaking letters, written in increasingly desperate handwriting. As if the author had lost his mind, the tone of the letters changed from romantic to obsessive, from loving to terrifying. Each word seemed impregnated with an insane madness, an intense need that went beyond all limits. I realized that the man I found downstairs was no stranger to this house. He had probably spent his last days here, writing and rewriting those messages, trapped in a spiral of obsession for someone who was no longer there. A gust of icy wind swept through the room, and all the letters rose momentarily before falling to the floor. I looked towards the open window and saw my own reflection in the glass, but something in that reflection wasn't right. It wasn't my expression, but something in the eyes, a shadow I didn't recognize. At that moment, a sense of urgency hit me, and I knew I had to get out of there. As I turned towards the door, I heard footsteps in the corridor. They were light, almost imperceptible, but the sound was clear in the silence. I stood motionless, listening intently. The footsteps stopped outside the room. My heart began to beat fast, and I found myself hoping that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. However, the weight of that presence was undeniable. It was as if the whole house had come to life and was watching me, waiting for me to take the next step. I didn't dare open the door straight away. Instead, I backed away, my gaze fixed on the doorway, feeling fear take hold of me in a way I had never experienced before. Finally, I plucked up my courage and went out into the hallway. To my surprise, it was empty, and the silence was so thick that it seemed as if the house itself was holding its breath. I hurried down the stairs, feeling as if something or someone was following me closely. When I reached the ground floor, I noticed that the light in the man's room had gone out. A chill ran through my body, but I decided not to stop. I just wanted to get out of there, leave that house and never return. On leaving, I saw a dark figure at the window, a shadow that seemed almost unreal. Something inside me reacted like a spring. My police instinct, numbed by fear, immediately resurfaced. I stopped walking and put my hand on the radio. I could still feel the fixed gaze from the window, the enigmatic presence watching me in silence. "I need backup at my location," I said, trying to make my voice sound firm, despite the uneasiness that still ran through my body. They didn't take long to respond, and within a few minutes several patrol cars arrived at the scene. As the officers fanned out around the house, I explained what I had seen: the lifeless body of the man in the chair, the letters addressed to Amelia, and finally that presence at the window. The atmosphere was tense, and the rain was still falling hard, drowning out any other sound. We entered the house, this time accompanied, and went up to the second floor together. The agents searched every corner, moving papers and old furniture. It was in one of the rooms at the back that one of them issued a warning in a low voice. Upon entering, I found myself faced with a scene that could only be described as disturbing. A man in his 30s, with a blank stare and a pale face, was standing in the corner of the room, staring at us without blinking. He was the son of the dead man, as we later confirmed. His mind had long since succumbed to an unfathomable darkness, trapped in that house along with the memories of a woman who was no longer there. Amelia, his mother, whom he had apparently lost years ago. He lived in the shadows of the house, consumed by his father's obsession, in such absolute silence that the neighbors hardly knew of his existence. That night ended with the young man in custody, but his image remained etched in my mind like a shadow, a warning about the power of loneliness and abandonment. Closing that case, I understood that some horrors don't need monsters or spirits. Sometimes human madness and emotional emptiness are enough to create the worst specters. It was a dense, humid night, one of those nights when the air seems to be soaked in something more than just water, an intangible, sticky weight that penetrates the bones and makes the cold feel more alive. The train station was almost deserted. The lights flickered from time to time, reflecting their yellow, deathly tones on the wet asphalt. He had arrived earlier than planned, wanting to avoid the nightmare of the last minute. He knew that the next train would be a long time coming, but it didn't matter. He preferred the silence, the emptiness of the platforms. Or at least that's what he thought. The rain had been falling relentlessly for hours. The drops resonated on the metal roof of the station, on the pavement, on the leaves of the few trees that peeked out from between the buildings. Every sound seemed to be amplified in that darkness. And although the echo of the lonely station should have been reassuring, the truth is that I was starting to feel uneasy. Perhaps it was the accumulation of sounds, or the way the light reflected in the puddles, creating strange shadows, but I couldn't shake an uneasiness that was beginning to creep into my mind. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, that the tiredness and the rain created that oppressive atmosphere, that the reason the air felt so heavy was simply the weather, but little by little I began to notice something else, a kind of vibration in the atmosphere, a feeling that I couldn't shake off. I looked around. The station was completely empty, just the way I liked it. There weren't even any attendants or cleaners. Just the dark wooden benches, the locked ticket offices, and the distant flicker of a security camera that probably hadn't been working for months. I tried to relax and breathe deeply, but I felt a strange pressure in my chest. That's when I saw it. He was at the end of the platform on a corner a few meters from a pillar. At first, he was just a blur, a shadow among shadows, but little by little, his outline began to take shape. I couldn't see his face as the station light barely reached him, but it was clear that he was looking at me, motionless, standing in the rain that was falling with increasing force. I don't know how I knew that he was watching me, because the distance and the darkness made it almost impossible, but I knew it. It was a certainty that penetrated me to the bone. I tried to look away, to pretend I hadn't noticed, but it was impossible. The figure was there, present in every one of my thoughts, filling every second with unease. I told myself there was no reason to be alarmed, that he was just any passer by waiting for the same train, someone who, like me, preferred not to draw attention to himself. And yet, with every passing second, I felt him closer, even though he hadn't taken a single step. My gaze returned to him again and again, as if an invisible force were pushing me to do so. I noticed that he was wearing a dark, long, and worn coat, as if he had seen too many nights like that one. His posture was rigid. Even so, I couldn't see his face. The visor of his cap covered his eyes, casting an eerie shadow over the rest of his figure. It was as if his presence somehow absorbed what little light remained in the station. The minutes passed and the train did not appear. With each passing second, I felt more vulnerable, more exposed. The rain was getting stronger, forming streams that meandered between the cobblestones of the ground and the tracks. In the distance, the sound of lightning broke the monotony of the falling drops, but it failed to distract me. The stranger was still there, immovable, like a lifeless statue. I clenched my fists and tried to concentrate on the sounds of my own breathing and the constant dripping. There was no logical reason for the fear I felt. I hadn't done anything. He was just standing there looking at me, or so I thought. But then something inside me told me that this man wasn't just a passerby. Something in his posture, in the way his shoulders slumped, relaxed and without tension, suggested to me that he wasn't waiting for a train. The lights flickered again, and for an instant I could see his face. It was just a flash, a fraction of a second, in which the light revealed strange features, too pale and with a special shine in the eyes. I shuddered. I wanted to move, to take a few steps to get away from him, but my legs seemed to be anchored to the ground. It was as if an invisible force was holding me to the platform, forcing me to remain in that place to endure his presence. I looked at the station clock. The train should have arrived 10 minutes ago. Weather delays, I thought, trying to calm down, but that excuse only increased my anxiety. As if deep down I knew that the delay was just another detail in a series of unfortunate events that would culminate in something worse. The minutes passed, and the man was still there, motionless. His eyes, or whatever it was, he was hiding under the shadow of his cap, seemed to be looking right through me, stripping away any attempt I might have made to rationalize the situation. I imagined how his footsteps would echo on the floor if he decided to come closer. I wondered if I would hear him breathing as he approached, if there would be any change in his posture before he moved. But he did none of that. He was just there looking at me. Thunder rumbled in the distance and the station lights flickered again. For a moment I thought they would go out completely, leaving me alone in the darkness with him, but they came back on, although weaker, flickering in a sinister choreography that only increased my tension. I tried to convince myself that it was all a coincidence, that I was just exaggerating, but the fear wouldn't go away. It seemed to grow, to multiply with every second that man remained in his place, watching me from the shadows. I could feel it as a pressure in my chest, a tingling in my back, a jolt of adrenaline pushing me to flee, to run without looking back. But something inside me knew that if I did, that man would follow me, and then there would be no going back. I gritted my teeth and closed my eyes, trying to block out his presence, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But when I opened them, the man was no longer where I had last seen him. My heart skipped a beat. Now he was a few meters closer, under the dim light of another lamppost, still looking at me with the same intensity. It was as if the distance between us had disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if every time I looked away, he could move forward without being seen. I felt my body tense, every muscle preparing for a flight that I didn't dare to initiate. Maybe if I ran, but I knew that would only make things worse. I forced myself to look at the clock once more, as if the passing of the minutes might restore my calm. But each tick seemed like a taunt, a reminder that I was trapped on that lonely platform in the rain with a man who was getting closer and closer. The weight became unbearable. Every second was torture. I couldn't look anywhere else without feeling his presence behind my thoughts. And as the minutes slowly ticked by, I thought that night there would be no train to take me back home. The clock marked one more minute. Each second felt like an eternity, and the echo of the rain seemed to intensify, covering me with a layer of fear that I couldn't shake. But just when I was about to give in to that feeling of imminent danger, I heard something. It was such a faint sound that at first I thought it was just another distant clap of thunder, but no, it was a metallic rumble coming from the tracks, a sound that grew louder as it approached. The train was finally coming. The light from the locomotive appeared in the distance, illuminating the platform with a warm and powerful glow that restored, if only momentarily, some sense of security. Turning my head towards the place where the man had been, I saw him motionless, as if the arrival of the train had not made the slightest impact on him. He was still there with the same rigid posture and the gaze that I could no longer make out, but which I could still feel fixed on me. The train stopped, and a group of passengers hurriedly got off, some running to escape the rain, others chatting and laughing as they stared at the storm. It was an indescribable relief to see them, to hear their voices and feel the flow of people around me, bringing me back to the real world and relieving me of that unbearable oppression. Without hesitation, I got on the train with them, feeling my heart racing, but relieved as if I were leaving a nightmare behind. Once in the carriage from the window, I looked at the stranger once more. He was still standing on the platform, motionless in the rain. I made no effort to board the train. His figure faded into the shadows as the train pulled away, and I realized that his purpose was not to board that train, but something much darker. As the train pulled away, a chilling thought crossed my mind. Perhaps that man would stay there waiting in silence until someone else arrived alone, vulnerable in the middle of the rain. I never knew what his real intention was, if he only wanted to frighten me, or if he was looking for something else, something I didn't dare imagine. But as I felt the warmth of the carriage and was surrounded by unfamiliar faces, I repeated to myself almost as a prayer that fortunately that night I had managed to escape. The rain was falling with overwhelming intensity, as if the sky had decided to unleash its fury upon us. The drops hit the mud, creating a dull sound that drowned out any other noise. It was the darkest night I had ever experienced, and not just because of the storm. It was too immense, and we were in the middle of a mission in hostile territory. Visibility was almost zero, and the piercing cold pierced my bones. I was in a small trench soaked to the bone with my rifle resting on the damp earth. Mood had taken over everything around me, and my companions were scattered, each in their position, hoping that the storm would give us a break. But in this place, the storm was not just meteorological. It was a storm of war, a chaos that we could smell in the air. Despite the sound of the rain, I could hear something, a distant murmur that disturbed me. I strained to listen, trying to make out the sounds emerging from the roar of the water. Then I heard it, gunshots. The sound was intermittent like a distant echo, but it was getting closer. Adrenaline shot through my system, and my survival instincts kicked in. The storm seemed to intensify, and the bursts of gunfire turned into screams. The screams of my companions mixed with the din of war created a symphony of terror that paralyzed me. What was happening? The uncertainty filled me with panic. I knew I couldn't stay here, but the idea of going out into the open under enemy fire filled me with doubts. I decided I had to move carefully. I crawled through the mud, trying not to make any noise. My mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. Could it be my colleagues who were shouting? Was anyone hurt? The rain didn't stop falling, and every step I took felt like another weight on my conscience. Bullets whistled around me, and the sound of gunfire grew ever more intense. I felt trapped in a nightmare, a labyrinth in which every choice could mean life or death. I managed to reach a higher position, a small mound that gave me a better view of the battlefield. From there, I could see flashes of light in the distance, the fire of weapons briefly illuminating the darkness. My heart was pounding as I tried to focus my vision. In the midst of the chaos, I saw silhouettes moving among the trees, figures gliding quickly by like shadows in the night. The confusion was palpable. Were they friend or foe? The terrain was becoming increasingly slippery. I crawled to a safer place, but my mind could not stop thinking about my companions. Uncertainty devoured me. War was not just about shooting and hiding. It was a mental game, a constant struggle against fear and despair. Suddenly, a heart-rending scream rang out to my right. My body tensed. I wasn't sure if it was coming from a friend or an enemy, but the terror was the same. The idea of losing someone, of not being able to do anything to help, filled me with impotence. I knew I had to act. I began to move towards the sound, aware that every step was a risk. The rain was falling harder, and the mud stuck to my boots, making it difficult to move forward. Every moment I thought I might be discovered, that a sniper might be watching me in the darkness. Anxiety enveloped me, and adrenaline coursed through my veins. The sound of gunfire grew closer, and my heart raced. I reached an area where the sound was clearer. Through the shadows, I saw a group of soldiers, but they were not from my unit. They were enemies, and they were surrounding one of my comrades, trapped and vulnerable. Panic took hold of me. I had to help him, but I couldn't act without thinking. I watched from a safe place, trying to assess the situation. My partner was on the ground trying to cover himself, but he was in a disadvantageous position, the screams mixed with the gunshots creating a deafening chaos. As I contemplated the scene, I realized that I didn't have much time. The situation was critical, and I had to act fast. I looked for my rifle, but my hands were shaking. I couldn't let doubt paralyze me. I took a deep breath and prepared for movement. Cautiously, I crawled to the side, looking for an angle that would allow me to shoot without being seen. Darkness covered me, but so did the danger. Bullets whistled around me, and the sound of war intensified. I found a place where I could take up the right position. With my heart in my throat, I raised my rifle, aiming at one of the enemies. The tension was unbearable. At that moment, everything stopped. The rain, the screams, the gunfire, everything faded into a deafening silence. I took aim and my finger hovered millimeters from the trigger. I realized that there was one more element in the scene, the fear in my partner's eyes, a fear that I couldn't afford to ignore. A man's life was in my hands, and the responsibility hit me like a bolt of lightning. In my mind, everything was chaos. I pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was like thunder, breaking the night. The enemy figure vanished into the darkness, and my partner, seeing his chance, got up and started running towards me. But before he could react, I heard a terrifying scream, and everything fell apart. The sound of the shot echoed in my mind, and confusion enveloped me once again. My companion fell to the ground, and horror took hold of me. I didn't know if the shot had missed, or if he had been hit by another bullet. The sound of my own heart beating was deafening. I realized that I was being surrounded. The rain had hidden the movements of the enemies, and now they were close. I felt the pressure growing in my chest, the terror of knowing that I was about to be discovered. The rain became a veil of despair, and darkness enveloped me. I began to back away, looking for the exit, but the slippery ground betrayed me. I fell on my back and the mud trapped me. In that instant, I saw the shadows approaching, figures emerging from the darkness, and I knew I could not escape. The war had taken its toll, and the outcome was uncertain. As I tried to get up, I saw several enemy soldiers advancing. The confusion was total, and fear turned into palpable desperation. I knew that if they caught me, there would be no way out. I managed to stand up, the mud covering my boots. Something in me had hardened. I started to run with no clear destination, just the instinct to survive. The shadows followed me, but I couldn't look back. It was a deadly game, and uncertainty pushed me forward with every step. As I ran, I heard more gunshots, but this time it wasn't just the enemies, it was my companions. The sound of the fight continuing all around us. War had broken out in all its fury, and I was just a pawn on this deadly board. I found a place to hide, a small refuge in the middle of the storm. I crouched down, trying to catch my breath. As the rain continued to fall, the sound of the fighting faded in the distance, and in that moment of calm, I realized that the war was not only being waged on the battlefield, it was also being waged in the minds of each one of us. The terror of the unknown took hold of me, and the uncertainty was a weight I could not bear. I knew I had to find my companions, but the idea of leaving my hiding place filled me with fear. I strained to hear any sound that might tell me what had happened. The voices of my companions echoed in my mind, and the thought of losing someone overwhelmed me. War had a cruel way of stripping people of everything they loved, and I didn't want to be another victim. After what seemed like an eternity, the sound of combat began to fade, but silence took over the place. Cautiously, I began to leave my hiding place, feeling that each step was an internal battle. When I came out, the landscape was desolate. The shadows of the night had dissipated, but the rain continued, creating a gloomy atmosphere. I walked slowly, trying to find some sign of my companions. The ground was covered in mud, and the air was impregnated with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. I saw a figure in the distance. My heart stopped for a moment. It was a colleague, but he was wounded. His face was covered in mud and blood, and his gaze reflected despair. I ran towards him, feeling hope reborn inside me. When I arrived, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had survived. There were others. Some injured, others in shock, but we were all alive. The storm had passed, and although the battle wasn't over, at least we had managed to make it out alive. As we gathered, The rain began to ease and the sky slowly cleared. The storm had left its mark, but it had also brought a new clarity. Despite the horror of that night, we knew we were stronger together. Uncertainty still lurked, but in those shared moments, I found the strength to face whatever came next. The vibe would never be easy, and the struggle for survival would continue, but in the midst of the storm, I had learned that hope can arise even in the darkest of moments. And so, as the sun began to peek through the clouds, I knew that despite everything we were alive. The rain fell furiously that night, as if the sky were overflowing. The raindrops hit the asphalt of the road, creating puddles that reflected the lights of passing cars. But at that moment, I had no intention of continuing on my way. My car had decided to break down in the middle of nowhere. And although I had tried to start it over and over again, the engine refused to respond. I got out of the vehicle, feeling the water soaking my clothes. Darkness enveloped me, and the only sound was the sound of the water falling and the distant roar of thunder. I looked around, looking for any sign of civilization. There was nothing, just a dusty road and the undergrowth that stretched into a dense forest on one side and empty terrain on the other. After a moment, I decided it would be best to look for help. The last gas station was behind me, and I didn't know how long it had been since I saw it. With a resigned sigh, I headed towards the undergrowth, feeling that each step took me further away from the safety of the car. The rain continued to fall, and the darkness felt deeper among the trees. As I walked, anxiety began to take hold of me. I hadn't seen anyone since I was left stranded, and the idea of being alone in the forest filled me with unease. The night seemed to come to life, and the air felt tense. The feeling of being watched intensified. I continued on, my feet splashing in the mud, until I came to a small crossroads. A wooden sign worn by time and rain indicated two paths, one that went deeper into the forest, and another that seemed to lead towards a hill. At that moment I felt the weight of the decision I had to make. The rain was falling harder, and the wind howled through the trees, as if warning me of something. I opted for the path up the hill. The idea of climbing up and finding a high place where I could see something of the road seemed the best option. I began to ascend, fighting against the slippery mud. As I progressed, the darkness became denser, and the sounds of the forest turned into an eerie murmur. I reached the top of the hill. From there, I could see a small cabin in the distance, dimly lit by a light in the window. My heart skipped a beat. The cabin seemed like a safe haven, a place where I could find help without thinking twice. I headed towards it. As I got closer, the light got brighter, but the atmosphere became ominous. The cabin, although it seemed cozy, had an air of abandonment. The door frame was worn, and the paint was chipped. However, the sound of the rain was deafening, and I had no choice. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I pushed it gently, and it opened with a creak. I entered, feeling the cold, damp air around me. The room was dark, with only a flickering lamp illuminating the place. The decor was rudimentary, a couple of old chairs, a wooden table, and a dead fireplace. The place smelled of mold and damp wood, and the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. As I looked around, I noticed that there was something strange about the walls. Framed photographs showed different people, each with a disturbing expression. I looked more closely and realized that they all bore a striking resemblance. They were men, women, and children with features that resembled mine. I began to feel a knot in my stomach. I turned towards the door, but it slammed shut as if an invisible force had pushed it. The sound of the wind and rain faded away, and the silence became overwhelming. The feeling of being trapped began to grow in my chest. I looked out of the window, but the storm had obscured the view. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. A man appeared in the gloom, his dark figure silhouetted against the dim light. His gaze was piercing, and an ominous smile played across his face. Fear took hold of me. I tried to back towards the door, but the man moved quickly, blocking my way. I could see in his eyes a mixture of amusement and malice, as if he were enjoying my desperation. "Are you lost, mate?" he said, his voice low and almost whispering. I didn't reply. Adrenaline coursed through my veins and the need to escape became urgent. The man took a step closer, and I could see a scar running across his face. "Don't worry, they're all here for a reason," he continued, pointing to the photos on the walls. Horror gripped me as I understood their significance. They were not just photographs, they were portraits of missing persons, each marked by time in this cabin. The man smiled even wider, as if he expected me to understand the gravity of the situation. As I backed away, my feet stumbled over a chair and I fell to the floor. The man approached, his smile widening, and I felt the air escape from my lungs. What did he want from me? The thought that I might be just another victim filled me with terror. At that moment, my survival instinct kicked in. I got up quickly and ran towards the window. Without thinking, I tried to open it, but it was stuck. I looked back and the man was advancing slowly, enjoying my distress. It was as if he were toying with me, and time stretched into an eternal instant. I managed to open the window with an effort. The rain hit me hard, but I didn't have time to think about it. I jumped out, landing in a puddle. The cold of the water shook me, but I didn't stop. I ran towards the forest, feeling the darkness enveloping me. The sound of my footsteps mingled with the rain, and adrenaline drove me forward. I didn't know if the man was coming after me, but I couldn't risk looking. I ran and ran, fear gripping my chest. Suddenly I tripped and fell to the ground, hitting my knee. The pain made me scream, but I couldn't afford to give up. I got up quickly and continued running deeper into the forest. The rain was still falling, and darkness seemed to close in around me. As I ran, I thought of my family, of what I would leave behind if I didn't manage to escape. The thought of never seeing my loved ones again filled me with renewed determination. I found a path that seemed to lead to the road. Hope filled me, and I quickened my pace. However, the feeling of being followed never disappeared. I looked back but saw nothing, only darkness and rain. When I reached the path, I saw the lights of a car in the distance. I felt a new surge of hope. I ran towards the road, and as I got closer, I raised my hand to stop the vehicle. The car stopped and the window was lowered slowly. The driver, an older man, looked at me with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. I couldn't speak, so I nodded and got into the car. As I sat down, I felt a momentary relief, but the uneasiness remained. The man started driving, and I briefly told him what had happened, omitting details that might have frightened him. As we drove on, the rain began to ease, but the tension in my chest did not go away. I looked back, expecting to see the cabin or the man who had tried to catch me, but there was nothing. The road was empty and the forest seemed quiet. After a while, we arrived at a village. The man took me to the police station where they helped me tell my story. They assured me that there would be patrols in the area, but something in me knew that the cabin was still there, hidden in the darkness of the forest. That night, the police organized a search of the area, guided by the coordinates I had provided. While waiting for the rain to clear, the officers reviewed reports of missing persons in the region. My story resonated in their ears and the concern on their faces was palpable. At dawn, groups of police and volunteers went into the forest. The sky was still cloudy, but the rain had stopped, allowing visibility to improve. Meanwhile, I stayed at the station, anxious and fearful of what they might find. It was a long, intense day. Each hour that passed seemed like an eternity. The hours slipped by, and my thoughts were filled with images of the cabin, of the man with the scar, and of the photographs I had seen. As evening fell, a group of officers returned, and their expressions said it all. They had found the cabin. The police began to solve several cases of disappearances that had been unsolved for years. The photos I had seen on the walls were not just memories. They were evidence of crimes that had gone unanswered. The cabin became the epicenter of an investigation that revealed the dark story of a man who had been hunting his victims for decades. The news spread quickly, and although the horror of what had happened there haunted me, I felt a sense of relief knowing that the search had paid off. The police managed to rescue people who had been missing, and the man was arrested, facing charges he could never have imagined. As the days passed, life in the village began to return to normal. However, the rain continued to fall, reminding me how close I had come to being another victim. The experience had left deep scars, but also a lesson. Darkness can hide many secrets, and sometimes the truth is closer than we think. Although the terror of that night in the cabin would never completely fade, justice had prevailed. I knew that although the scars of that experience would always be with me, I had found a way to face my fears and move on. The rain, which once symbolized terror, now also reminded me of the hope that the truth always finds a way to come to light. The rain lashed furiously as I drove along that forgotten road, a path that my GPS seemed to have taken as a joke. I was on a work trip in a city hundreds of kilometers from home, a region I was hardly familiar with. My colleagues had warned me to avoid that area, that the road was not safe, but I ignored their advice, believing that I had everything under control. Looking out of the window, the storm distorted the landscape, a world of shadows and silhouettes in which I felt trapped. The dashboard clock read 11 at night, and although the car was moving slowly, I couldn't see more than a couple of meters ahead. The rain had become an impenetrable curtain, as if the sky itself had decided to make me lose my way. The asphalt disappeared under a layer of mud and water, and I was forced to stop in the middle of nowhere. Trees stretched in all directions, and the sound of rain hammering on the roof of the car reminded me that I was completely alone in that unchanging darkness. I felt a weight on my chest, a mixture of uncertainty and panic. I tried to calm down, turning on the GPS again and trying to find an alternative route, but the signal was weak, and I couldn't load a new path. For a moment, I thought about retracing my steps, but the idea of facing that same muddy and slippery road in the dark made me hesitate. I decided to wait a few minutes, hoping that the storm would subside. However, with each passing minute, the rain became more intense, the thunder more deafening, and the anguish and invisible monster growing in my mind. After a while, a shadow moved in the rear-view mirror. My heart skipped a beat at the sight of someone approaching. I thought it was a lost passer-by or a local peasant seeking shelter, but I soon realized it wasn't an isolated person. A second figure appeared behind the first, and then a third. Their faces were indistinguishable in the gloom. I could only see their hunched bodies slowly approaching my vehicle. There were several of them, and their presence made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the rain that made my chest feel tight. It was that silent procession of shadows approaching, like a threat I didn't understand, but which I sensed was dangerous. The first figure came up to the side of the car and tapped gently on the window. For a moment, I thought they were looking for help. Perhaps they needed directions or some shelter, but then my eyes caught something in their gaze, a calculating coldness that left no room for doubt. I looked over to the passenger seat, and there was my briefcase, my wallet, and my cell phone. Everything that in the wrong hands could make me a victim. I pressed my lips together and tried not to look the stranger in the eye, convinced that if I showed any sign of weakness they would notice it. The man by the window waited a moment, and then there was a sharp knock on the door, and he took a few steps back. Anxiety took hold of me, and I knew that something was terribly wrong. I decided to start the engine, but the car wouldn't start. I felt panic growing in my chest as if an invisible claw was squeezing my heart. I tried again, turning the key in the ignition, and nothing. The sound of the rain intensified, and each blow of water against the windshield seemed like a cry of warning. The men outside looked at each other, and one of them smiled with an expression of cruelty that chilled me to the bone. Then I realized I had no choice. I left my belongings and opened the opposite door to go out in the opposite direction to them. The rain hit me like an icy wall, making every step I took on the soaked ground difficult. I didn't look back because I knew they were following me. I could hear their footsteps in the mud, barely audible whispers mingling with the sound of the storm. I was alone and lost in the darkness, and with every step I took, I felt my strength fading. I tripped several times, and each fall seemed to invite my pursuers to close the distance. The forest around the path was thick, and the vegetation got in my way with every step. In the distance, lightning lit up the sky, and in that flash, I could see them getting closer. There were 4 of them in total, each one closer than the last, and their figures were outlined in the glare like grotesque and menacing shadows. My breathing was labored, and fatigue weighed on my feet as if I had stones tied to my legs. At that moment, I didn't know whether to keep going or stop and face the terror that was haunting me. After what seemed like an eternity of running, I came to a kind of clearing. I felt a false sense of relief, thinking that maybe there I would find an escape route, a road, or some sign of civilization. But there was nothing, just trees, mud, and a dark sky that looked at me indifferently. The rain did not stop, and its sound enveloped me in a bubble of desolation. I wondered if this would be the last night of my life, if these men would be the last faces I would see before disappearing without a trace. I felt their presence getting closer, the sound of their footsteps on the mud, the crackling of branches, and the panting of their heavy breathing. It was as if they were toying with me, as if they wanted to make me run just to enjoy my desperation, my palpable fear. I began to believe that this chase was no coincidence, that those men not only wanted to rob me, but also enjoyed seeing how uncertainty and terror consumed me. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was clouding over. I could hardly think clearly. I could hardly remember which direction I had taken. Every step plunged me into the mud. Every breath became a titanic effort, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. Suddenly I slipped and fell on an exposed root, hitting my knee. The pain was unbearable, but the fear was even greater. I couldn't stay there exposed, vulnerable, waiting for them to catch up with me. With all my strength, I got to my feet and started running again, limping. I knew I wouldn't be able to go on much longer, that my body was on the verge of collapse. My clothes were soaked, my hands were shaking, and my vision was blurred by the rain that kept falling on my face. But something inside me refused to give up. Something inside me pushed me to keep going, not to stop. Finally, my eyes caught sight of a faint light in the distance. It was small and distant, but at that moment it represented my only hope. Without hesitation, I made my way towards it, pushing through branches and bushes that scratched my skin. As I got closer, the light grew stronger, revealing what appeared to be a small abandoned hut. It was a precarious refuge, but it was better than the elements, better than facing my pursuers in the open. I approached the door and pushed it open. As I did so, a damp, musty smell hit me, but I didn't care. I closed the door behind me, trying to catch my breath while I looked for somewhere to hide, in case they came in. The interior was dark and cold, and I could barely make out some old dust-covered furniture. I hid behind a broken bookcase, waiting in silence, praying that they wouldn't find me. I could hear their footsteps outside, their macabre laughter carried to my ears on the wind. I knew they wouldn't stop until they found me, that it wasn't enough for them to just rob me. I wanted to believe that the cabin would offer me refuge, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't. The door was flimsy, and if they decided to come in, there would be nothing to protect me. A few minutes later, the sound of their footsteps faded away, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a fleeting relief, as if the storm had given me a break, a chance to escape. I dared to leave my hiding place and peer out of one of the windows. The rain was still falling hard, and the forest was a labyrinth of shadows and sounds that blended into a symphony of terror. While I waited, convinced that they had left, I felt a mixture of relief and paranoia. The cabin became deathly silent. Only the patter of the rain remained constant, like a macabre metronome, reminding me of the nightmare I was living. However, I couldn't stay there forever. My nerves and adrenaline were pushing me to do something, to move before those men came back. So, making sure not to make any noise, I left the cabin and ran again, this time with a clear objective to find a path or a road that would take me to a safe place. After a while of running non-stop, my legs were on the verge of collapse, and my vision was blurred with exhaustion. But then among the trees I saw lights flickering in the distance. The sight filled me with hope, and although my body resisted, I managed to take the last few steps until I reached the edge of the asphalt. It wasn't long before a vehicle appeared, and seeing my desperate state stopped, with my face soaked and covered in mud. I explained what had happened between gasps and pleas. The driver, surprised, allowed me to get in, and we quickly drove to the nearest police station. When we arrived, the police took my statement and sent units to the area in search of the criminals. Unfortunately, they did not manage to find them, and those men disappeared into the night like shadows. However, the memory of that night remained with me, etched in my mind. Every time I heard the sound of the rain or felt the darkness enveloping me, I relived the pure fear of those moments. I realized that I had survived by the skin of my teeth, and that the experience would mark me forever. An invisible scar that would remind me that sometimes the greatest danger does not come from the unknown, but from the human shadows that hide in the darkest corners of the world. I left work late that night, tired and overwhelmed. And to top it all off, the sky had opened up in one of the fiercest storms I had seen in months. The raindrops beat down on the asphalt with relentless intensity, bouncing off the ground like little bullets of water that blurred my vision and chilled my spirits. I still had to take the metro and walk a few minutes to get home, but with that storm, I preferred not to risk catching a fever or getting soaked. I'm not usually one to take taxis often, but that night, I saw no other alternative. I stuck out my arm, and with the speed that desperation gives, I managed to stop a taxi that miraculously appeared through the curtain of rain. The taxi stopped right in front of me, and without thinking too much about it, I opened the door and jumped inside, grateful for the dry warmth inside. No sooner had I settled into the back seat than the door closed behind me, isolating me from the storm that was still raging outside. I gave the taxi driver my home address, and he nodded silently without even looking at me. He was an ordinary-looking man with curly hair and an expressionless face. And although at first I didn't pay much attention to him, afterwards I wished I had the vehicle pulled away and drove into the almost deserted streets. At first, nothing seemed out of place. It was just a rainy night, and the silence was broken only by the patter of water on the roof and the puddles that the taxi crossed with ease. But as we drove on, I began to notice something strange about the road. The streets he was taking were not the usual ones, and although there was more than one way to get to my destination, I felt that something about his choice of road was erratic. I tried hard to remember the map of the city. The street lights were flickering, almost as if they were melting in the rain, and the silence inside the taxi became heavy, dense. I began to feel uncomfortable, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a different route. Maybe the taxi driver knew a shortcut to avoid the traffic that was still in the city. Although at that time of night, and with that storm, the idea that there was any traffic at all was absurd. The minutes passed and the road became increasingly unfamiliar, darker, as if we were entering the outskirts of the city. Street lighting became less frequent, and at times only the faint light of the headlights illuminated the road. I felt my breathing quicken for no reason, and as time went on, a growing tension settled in my chest. Something wasn't right, something in the atmosphere had changed, and a little voice told me that maybe it was time to ask the taxi driver to stop, that I was taking the wrong road. I tried to fix my gaze on the rearview mirror, hoping that the driver would give some sign that everything was under control, but his expression remained impassive. He was looking at the road with a cold intensity, his eyes fixed on the darkness, as if he knew it by heart. My discomfort turned into tangible unease, and I could no longer contain the urge to let him know that I sensed something strange about his choice of route. But as soon as I started to open my mouth, he suddenly turned onto an unpaved road, a detour that led to an even more isolated area. The road was practically a trail surrounded by undergrowth and trees that were barely distinguishable in the gloom. Only then did I understand the gravity of the situation I found myself in. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm, raging outside the car. I was in the middle of nowhere with a man who hadn't exchanged a single word with me, in an area where screams could be lost in the rain without anyone hearing them. I tried to stay calm, thinking of a way out, but the options seemed to slip away, vanishing into the air like the steam fogging up the windows of the car. The taxi stopped, the engine stopped, and the silence became oppressive, like a heavy blanket crushing me against the seat. I remained motionless, watching every movement of the driver, who for the first time turned his face towards me. His expression was still expressionless, almost calm. But there was something in his eyes that betrayed a dark intention, a dehumanized coldness. Without saying anything, he turned and opened the door on his side. Getting out of the car and leaving me alone inside, I didn't know what to do. My heart was beating so fast that I feared he could hear it even from outside. I thought about staying inside and waiting, but I didn't know for what or for whom. The rain was falling so hard that I could barely see through the windows. However, my instincts told me that it wasn't safe to stay there. I didn't know if he was armed or what his intentions were, but I didn't want to wait to find out. In desperation, I tried to open the door to run out, but I found that the back doors were blocked from the outside. I was trapped. I looked around, searching for a way out, a loophole, anything that would allow me to escape, but everything seemed closed off, sealed like a trap. My breathing became more and more frantic, and panic took hold of me with a speed I had never experienced before. In the midst of my despair, I saw his figure approach again, walking slowly around the car. He was carrying something in his hands, something I couldn't make out in the darkness. And it clouded my senses, and I began to bang on the window with all my might, hoping that someone, whoever it was, could hear me, although I knew that in that remote place and in that storm, my efforts were in vain. The man stopped by my door and opened the car, his movements slow and calculated, as if he knew I had no choice. He reached out his hand, looked at me with that disturbing expressionlessness, and without saying a word, took my wallet and phone, carefully examining each of my belongings. His gaze was analytical, as if he were assessing how much I was worth, how much time I had left, and then as suddenly as he had appeared, the man slammed the door and walked a few steps away. I watched him bewildered and terrified, not understanding what was happening. But before I could react, he started the engine, got out of the vehicle, and disappeared into the trees, leaving me out in the open with no company other than the storm and the emptiness that stretched out all around. For a while, I remained motionless, my mind in chaos, not knowing what to do. The rain was still falling heavily, and finally my survival instinct forced me to get out of the vehicle and start walking. Every step I took in the deep muddy darkness filled me with growing fear, but I knew that the only way out of there was to keep going without stopping, without looking back. Hours passed, or at least that's how it felt. The rain didn't stop and the cold seeped into my bones, but I continued, leaving fear behind and replacing it with blind determination, an urgent need to escape from that place. Finally, after a long walk, I came to a road and caught sight of the headlights of an approaching vehicle. I signaled desperately, and the driver stopped, surprised to see my state. He picked me up and took me to the city. The experience left a mark on me forever, a constant reminder that it doesn't take a monster or a supernatural creature to feel true terror, but the cold and calculating act of a human being who chooses to take everything away from you and leave you at the mercy of the night. Since then, every storm and every rainy night brings me back to fear, a warning that not all dangers are visible, and that at any moment, under any circumstances, darkness can appear in the most common, most everyday, and most human way possible. The rain lashed down with unusual fury that night, soaking the asphalt and erasing almost all visibility from the road. I could barely see more than a few meters in front of the car, and my hands were clinging tightly to the steering wheel. The storm had begun with increasing intensity, and the drive home was becoming a test of endurance I had not anticipated. At one point, I noticed that a car in the left lane seemed to be wobbling, as if the driver was having trouble keeping control. I decided to change lanes to keep myself safe and give him enough space. I didn't want to risk any accidents, especially on a night as dark and wet as that one. I activated my directional lights and moved slowly to the right, keeping a safe distance at first. I thought that would be enough, that I could relax, but instantly I felt something strange in the atmosphere, a kind of tension in the air, like a silent warning. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that the other car also changed lanes, coinciding with my movement. It was a sudden, almost desperate maneuver, as if its sole objective was to follow me. I tried to calm down, rationalizing that it could be a coincidence. Perhaps the driver simply had the same destination. However, a second later I changed lanes again, and the other car did so at the same time without even slowing down. My heart began to race. I knew something wasn't right, and unease started creeping into my thoughts. Was he following me? Why? Maybe it was just my imagination, or the stress of driving through the storm. But when I tried to overtake, speeding up to create some distance, the other car responded right away. It also sped up, pulling alarmingly close behind me, so close that its presence loomed in my rearview mirror like a dark shadow. The situation began to feel unreal, and a growing fear settled in my chest. I glanced in the mirror, hoping the driver would back off or slow down, but nothing changed. The rain kept pouring down, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep the view clear. As I tried to focus on the road and stay composed, the car behind started shifting from side to side, as if trying to unsettle me. Each second stretched on endlessly. I accelerated again, hoping to lose him on one of the road's curves, but he matched my every move with unsettling accuracy. That's when I realized this wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like I was part of a disturbing game. a game where the other driver seemed to feed off my unease and my efforts to get away. I did my best to stay calm, scanning for an alternative route, but the road offered few options, and the curves were slick and dangerous under the storm. My only real hope was to reach a better lit area, somewhere with other vehicles, a place that felt safer. But the road remained eerily empty, as if all other cars had vanished into the night, leaving me alone with whoever was behind me. Suddenly I saw an exit up ahead, and turned the steering wheel sharply, taking the detour onto a secondary road. I thought that maybe I could throw him off, that the abrupt maneuver would leave him behind, but I had only traveled a few meters when the roar of my pursuer's engine grew louder, and I realized that he had also taken the same exit, accelerating with inhuman ferocity. Despair completely overwhelmed me. My throat felt dry and cold, sweat was running down my forehead, mixing with the reflection of the lights bouncing off the mirror. With every second that passed, I realized that I was completely trapped. I tried to remember if there was a gas station, a restaurant, or any place that could be a safe haven, but my thoughts were in chaos. The sound of the rain, the windscreen wipers, and the roar of the car behind me blended into an oppressive symphony. It was at that moment that my pursuer began to get even closer, sticking to my bumper like an extension of my own car. I could feel his presence so close that it seemed as if he was about to ram into me. I tried to maintain control, but every time I slowed down or tried to turn, he replicated my movements with almost terrifying precision. Second later, the car behind me switched on its high beams, momentarily blinding me and causing panic to hit me hard. My visibility was reduced to almost nothing, and with my heart beating at full speed, I turned again to avoid what seemed like an onslaught. The rain was now almost a solid curtain in front of me, and the high beams of the other car were illuminating every corner of the road, erratically casting deformed shadows that seemed to mock my desperation. Fear turned into adrenaline, into a survival instinct that told me I couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The road was getting narrower and narrower, and the sound of the rain was deafening. I tried to focus on keeping control of the car, but at every bend, I felt that my pursuer was closer, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. The other car began to move alongside me, trying to get right up my tail. I could see it overtaking me, dangerously close to my side, as if it wanted to force me off the road. I turned the steering wheel sharply, trying to stay in my lane and avoid impact. My breathing was fast and shallow, every muscle in my body tense from the effort of resisting. In a desperate attempt, I turned the steering wheel and accelerated even more, taking it to the limit, praying that my car would hold out. I could feel the engine roaring, straining to the maximum, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel as I watched the lights of the other car disappear a little behind me, as if I was finally managing to leave it behind, but it was just an illusion. As soon as I slowed down a little to regain control, the car reappeared in my rearview mirror, even closer, even more menacing. My mind was on the verge of collapse, struggling to find a way out of a labyrinth of darkness and rain. Finally, after what seemed like hours of pursuit, I saw the lights of a small service station. Without thinking, I turned towards the illuminated area, braking suddenly and getting out of the car in a clumsy and desperate movement. I ran towards the station, hoping to find some sign of help, some human figure that could rescue me from this nightmare. But as I turned around, I noticed that my pursuer had not followed me to the station. His car had stopped right at the entrance, and from there, his barely visible figure was watching me motionless, as if he wanted me to know that this was not over. He was a silent and faceless presence, someone who had decided to make me his prey, and who was now enjoying the fear he had caused me. I stood there breathless and exhausted, watching as his car slowly turned around and disappeared into the darkness.